Okay, we will now look at different causes of war, and we will start with the Thucydides trap, or power transition theory. Now, why is it called the Thucydides trap? Well, it comes from a quote that he wrote in one of his books about ancient Greece. Essentially, he said, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Or in other words, the risk of war increases, particularly when there is a rising, unsatisfied challenger that is approaching the power of the dominant state. So we acknowledge that states rise or fall, but it's that intersecting period when the hegemon or the dominant power is beginning to weaken relative to the strengths of the rising power. Why are we talking about this now? Well, this theory has gained in popularity in the last 5 years or so. Why? Primarily because China is a rising power and significant threat to the dominant position of the United States. A prominent academic called Graham Allison wrote a book titled The Thucydides Trap, in which he argued that war, while not inevitable, is increasingly likely for this reason. In the theoretical section of this book and in other places, he created an argument based on historical examples that show where war has occurred as a result of power transitions. In this table here, you can see a breakdown of some of these major ones. If you just look, for example, the rising power of England, and the ruling power of the Dutch Republic, ending in war in the 17th century. France rising up against the United Kingdom in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Germany under Bismarck rising up against France in the 19th century and succeeding. World War I and World War II, where you had Germany as unsatisfied rising powers seeking to overthrow the dominance of the other major European powers. Even Japan rising up against the dominant power of the United States in the Pacific in World War II. But of course there are examples where war did not break out as well. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States, arguably the Soviet Union was the rising power, the US was the dominant power, and no war occurred. Why? Primarily because of nuclear weapons, many would argue. But if you go back before then, in the early 20th century, the US was the rising world power, the United Kingdom was the dominant global power, and the United Kingdom calmly handed over power to the US and accepted US dominance. So this theory does have critics. Some have argued that Allison and other people who advocate power transition theory do not have enough historical data or do not use enough historical data to argue that war is more likely. And others say they do not satisfactorily explain when war does not occur. So if you take that example of the US and the United Kingdom in the early 20th century, we have to ask, why would war not occur? Some would say it was because both countries were forms of democracy, and democracies do not fight each other, or very rarely fight each other. Others argue that geography played a substantial role, and that even though the United States became the dominant power, the Atlantic Ocean provided enough protection for the UK that it did not feel an existential threat. Others would argue that because the UK and the US had similar understandings of the international trading system, that the UK was satisfied to hand over power to the United States because it knew its own interests would ultimately be protected. Whatever the explanations, there are cases where war does not occur when rising powers intersect with declining ruling powers. So this leads us to the big question. Is war between the US and China inevitable? Now, there are two mechanisms when you have power transition that war could occur. The first is that the dissatisfied power will seek war to accelerate its transition. Now this has a puzzle to it. The dissatisfied power is not yet the dominant power, and yet will seek to fight a stronger power. Therefore, the risk of losing is extremely high. An example of this is Japan and the United States. During World War II. The other mechanism is the dominant power will seek war to prevent transition. Some, a small number admittedly, have argued that the United States should sink the Chinese fleet right now. Why? Because China's rise is almost inevitable. And why would you not take the opportunity that presents it now when China remains relatively weak and instead leave it to 10 or 15 years when China is going to be much more strong and the chances of success are much lower. Now, Allison argues that war is not inevitable, but is extremely difficult to avoid. And he mainly makes this argument because when you have a dominant power that is in relative decline but still seeks to maintain dominance, and a dissatisfied rising power, there is very small space for settlement. What can either side give up to keep them happy in order to avoid war? And Allison's argument is very little, and therefore we should be very aware of the fact that war could occur. Now, moving away from state and system level explanations, we need to look at leadership explanations. Very importantly, there are so many different theories for how people act and behave that it is difficult, if not impossible, to distill them all into one lesson or even one set of lectures. But we can look at certain leadership choices and trends that exist. One is based on prospect theory. Now they argue that people often, but not always, frame their choices based on the status quo or what is happening right now. A smaller number will frame their choices not by the status quo, but by the expectation or aspirational level. And third, most people will normalize gains more than losses. And what we mean there is that if you gain something, you will accept that as the status quo quicker than if you lose something. So what does this mean? Political and strategic leaders will often take greater risks to maintain their position than enhance it. If they do lose, if they do enter a conflict, we know that leaders are politically punished for losses more rather than a failure to make gains. And we also know that leaders will take greater risks to recover losses than to make gains. And these realities can make war much more likely. The example here is A makes gains against B. A normalizes these gains. For A, the gains become the status quo, will therefore defend them strongly. B is being punished internally for those losses and will therefore seek to recover the losses, and therefore war becomes much more likely. So a lot of this depends on who normalizes the status quo faster. And if one side does not, then war is more likely. Now this can tell us a lot about deterrence. It is easier to deter an opponent from making gains than to deter an opponent from recovering losses or from compelling them to accept losses. So if you use an example, let's say Russia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian strategic elites viewed many cases as losses. For example, Ukraine, Crimea, some of the former Soviet states. They have never internalized the new international structure as the status quo. And so they have taken great risks to re-establish or retake some of these gains, for example, Crimea. So when we're looking at history and how leaders act, we should bear these leadership preferences in mind. Of course, there are other leadership characteristics that play a role in conflict. Many people have looked at the Iraq War as an example of poor information processing and irrational thought to make a decision for war. And some of the core ideas are distorted perceptions, information bias, expectation confirmation, and emotions in determining policy and security choices. Now, for example, as this cartoon points out, before the war, the US leadership was convinced there were weapons of mass destruction. They had a distorted perception about the world. This perception drove a bias towards specific types of information that confirmed this perception, but also forced strategic elites to ignore any information that countered this perception. So for them, their expectations were confirmed because they did not accept any information that countered those expectations. And therefore, war became more likely because they became locked into this choice, while on the other side had no way of countering it. Others have argued that emotions also play into this kind of decision-making process. Some would say, possibly critically, for example, that, as George W. Bush has stated, Saddam Hussein tried to kill my dad, and therefore war became more likely. Another example could be Japan against the United States and in World War II, where Japan attacked Pearl Harbor despite the warnings of many senior leaders because they had an expected information bias that the United States would not fight to maintain its position in the Pacific. Equally, Saddam Hussein, after he invaded Kuwait, despite repeated warnings from US leaders that the US would fight to regain Kuwait, did not believe and refused to accept that the US would accept military casualties over a small country in the Middle East. So very often one can search out for leadership characteristics based on distorted perceptions and information bias for, irrational decisions that result in war. But obviously, there are so many specific individual cases that coming up with a generalized theory becomes very, very difficult. And finally, of course, there are other causes of war. Some have argued that certain cultures are more inclined to conflict. Warrior cultures, for example. Many people have argued Sparta, as a militaristic culture in ancient Greece, was more inclined to war than others. Now, this depends on the historical record, but it is one argument. Secondly, regime type can play an important role in determining whether war occurs or not. At the beginning of the first video, I talked about democratic peace theory, i.e. the argument that democracies do not fight each other. Therefore, there is a smaller chance of war when two democracies are in some sort of policy conflict. Some people agree with this theory, and other people say this theory is not based on statistical reality or has weak statistical support. Others will argue that dictatorships are more likely to go to war, particularly to gain internal support. Relatedly, domestic politics such as nationalism can play a significant role in determining the course of war. The rise of nationalism in East Asia, for example, in the last 10 or 15 years, is a particularly challenging movement for political leaders who are seeking to dampen down tensions in the region. And if you combine dictatorship with nationalism, you can look at, for example, the Falklands War as an explanation for war. The Argentinian government were seeking to distract people from problems at home. They used the Falkland Islands or the Malvinas as a nationalist calling card in order to legitimize the regime. Of course, this is high risk, and if you lose the war, then you lose your own credibility. Finally, two more, very briefly. We have religion as a cause of war. Although in modern times this plays much more into intrastate wars than interstate wars. But if you go into history, the religious wars in Europe, for example, religion becomes a significant cause of war. Equally, ethnicity, you look at the former Yugoslavia, the Middle East today, ethnic background is a significant driver of conflict. So these two videos, we've discussed many different causes of war. And if you look at your lesson guide, I will now give you some pointers for discussions you should have in your group about causes of war, and then we can talk about these in the online session in the afternoon. Thank you.